April 23, 1945. 9:32 a.m. British checkpoint, 12 kilometers west of Bremen. The morning air smelled of diesel and wet earth. Rain had fallen through the night, leaving the road slick and the sky low and gray. 53 German women stood in a column at the roadside, hands bound behind their backs with rope that had been tied too tight, cutting circulation, leaving marks that would last for weeks. They had walked since dawn, escorted by remnants of a Wehrmacht unit that had surrendered 2 days earlier and now served as intermediaries between collapse and whatever came next. No one spoke. Silence was safer than questions. The British checkpoint appeared through the mist, canvas tents, a wooden barrier, soldiers in khaki uniforms smoking cigarettes and watching the column approach with expressions that revealed nothing. The women braced for violence, for humiliation, for the stories they had been told about what happened to prisoners. The first British soldier who approached them carried wire cutters. He said 5 words, "You're not animals. Hold still." The soldier was a sergeant, perhaps 35, with a lined face and steady hands. He moved down the column methodically, cutting the ropes one prisoner at a time. The first woman, a nurse named Margaret, 28, who had worked in a field hospital near the Weser River, flinched when he reached for her bindings. She expected pain. What she felt was release. The rope fell away. Blood rushed back into her hands. The sensation was agony and relief in equal measure. She brought her hands forward, staring at the raw marks on her wrists, and could not process what had just happened. The sergeant moved to the next woman. And the next. Behind him, other British soldiers distributed canteens of water, offered cigarettes, gestured toward the tents where field kitchens were set up. No one shouted. No one struck. No one leered. The women stood frozen, unable to reconcile expectation with reality, propaganda with this quiet, procedural decency. When the last rope was cut, the sergeant straightened and addressed them in careful German. His accent was thick but his words were clear. You will be processed. You will be fed. You will be treated in accordance with the law. Is anyone injured? Margaret raised her hand slowly, testing whether honesty was permitted. 2 are sick, she said. Her voice sounded strange in her own ears, hoarse, uncertain. Fever. They can barely walk. The sergeant nodded. He turned to a corporal standing nearby. Get the medic. Now. Within minutes, a British medical officer arrived, examined the sick women, and ordered them carried to a tent where cots had been set up. The others watched in stunned silence as their companions were treated not as burdens or threats but as patients. One of the sick women began to cry. The medic spoke to her gently, too quietly for the others to hear, and gave her water and a blanket. Margaret looked at her raw wrists. She looked at the sergeant who had cut the ropes. She thought about the officer who had tied them 3 days earlier, a captain in his 50s who had said, "You're prisoners now. You'll be treated as you deserve." She had assumed that meant brutality. She had been wrong about who would deliver it. If this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe, the next will surprise you even more. Margaret and the others had been captured during the final chaotic days of Germany's collapse. They were part of a medical unit attached to the 7th Army, operating a field hospital in a requisitioned schoolhouse outside Bremen. The front had disintegrated so quickly that orders became meaningless, supply lines vanished, and command structures dissolved into improvisation and panic. On April 20th, British forces reached the outskirts of the city. The hospital's senior officer, a surgeon in his 60s who had served in the First War, gathered the staff and spoke with the kind of exhausted clarity that comes when pretense no longer serves a purpose. The war is over, he said. For us, at least. We can run, or we can surrender. Running means abandoning the patients. I won't do that. Those who wish to leave may do so. The rest of us will wait. 43 stayed. Margaret among them. They treated the wounded until the British arrived, German soldiers mostly, but also displaced persons, civilians caught in crossfire, anyone who needed help. When the British entered the schoolhouse, they did so cautiously, rifles raised, expecting resistance. What they found were nurses covered in blood, doctors performing surgery with improvised tools, and rows of patients too injured to pose a threat. The British secured the building, posted guards, and allowed the medical work to continue. For 2 days, nothing changed except the nationality of the sentries. Then orders came from higher command. The medical personnel were to be evacuated and processed as prisoners of war. They were given 30 minutes to gather personal belongings, then loaded onto trucks and driven to a collection point where hundreds of other prisoners waited. That was where the ropes came. A Wehrmacht officer, no longer in command but clinging to authority out of habit or fear, insisted the prisoners be restrained for transport. The British officer supervising the collection point had shrugged and allowed it. "Your people, your rules," he had said. For now. The journey from the collection point to the checkpoint took 18 hours. The trucks broke down twice. Food ran out. Water was rationed. The women sat in the back of canvas-covered lorries, hands bound, listening to the sound of artillery in the distance and wondering if they would survive the night. Some whispered prayers. Others stared into middle distance, faces blank, already rehearsing the narratives they would tell themselves if they lived. When the trucks finally stopped and the women were ordered out, they found themselves at the edge of a muddy field where a temporary camp had been established. The Wehrmacht officer who had tied their hands gestured curtly toward the British checkpoint visible in the morning mist. "That's where we leave you," he said. "May God have mercy." He walked away without another word. The women stood in the rain, bound and exhausted, and began the final walk into captivity. At the checkpoint, after the ropes were cut and the sick were cared for, the women were led to a processing tent where British clerks recorded names, ranks, and units. The process was bureaucratic, almost tedious, forms in triplicate, questions asked in stilted German, stamps applied to documents that would follow the prisoners through the system. Margaret answered mechanically, giving her name, age, role, the hospital where she had served. The clerk wrote everything down without judgment or commentary, then handed her a card with a prisoner number. "Keep this," he said. "You'll need it for meals, mail, everything." She stared at the card. It was such a mundane object, this piece of paper that reduced her identity to a number. But it was also proof that she existed in the system, that she had been counted and recorded and would be tracked. In the chaos of the war's end, when so many simply vanished into mass graves or unmarked camps, being counted felt like a small mercy. After processing, the women were directed to another tent where food had been laid out: bread, cheese, tinned meat, tea. The portions were modest, Britain itself was still under rationing, but they were real, and they were offered without conditions. Margaret ate slowly, tasting each bite, feeling strength return to her limbs. Around her, the others did the same, silent except for the sound of chewing and the occasional clink of tin cups. A British soldier, a private, barely 20, with red hair and freckles, poured tea from a large urn. When he reached Margaret, he paused and said in halting German, "More." She nodded. He poured. She wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the warmth seep into her palms, and for the first time in 3 days, she felt something other than fear. "I thought decency had died with the war," she would write decades later in a memoir published in the 1980s, when enough time had passed that such stories could be told without accusations of collaboration. "I thought the British would treat us as we had been taught to expect, with cruelty, with contempt, with the violence that winners inflict on losers. But that sergeant with the wire cutters, that private who poured tea, they treated us as if we were still human. As if surrender had not erased our right to dignity. I did not understand it then. I'm not sure I understand it now." The philosophy guiding British treatment of prisoners had been forged over centuries of warfare and codified in the Geneva Conventions of 1929. But philosophy was one thing, implementation was another. In the spring of 1945, with millions of German soldiers and civilians surrendering across Europe, the logistics of captivity threatened to overwhelm the system. Camps were hastily constructed, supply chains strained, and personnel stretched thin. Yet the standard held: prisoners were to be treated humanely, fed adequately, sheltered properly, and protected from violence. A directive issued by the War Office in 1944 laid out the principles in language that was bureaucratic but unambiguous. Prisoners of war are combatants who have surrendered. They retain their dignity and their rights under international law. Retaliation for enemy abuses is prohibited. Cruelty serves no strategic purpose and undermines the moral foundation of our cause. The directive was distributed to every camp commandant, every processing officer, every guard tasked with managing the defeated. 3 pillars supported the system. Security: prisoners would be contained, their movements restricted, their potential for escape or sabotage minimized. Diplomacy: humane treatment protected British POWs held in German camps and preserved Britain's standing among allies and neutrals. Morality: restraint was the measure of civilization. To abandon it was to become indistinguishable from the enemy. These were not abstract ideals. They were enacted daily in the decisions of officers like the sergeant with the wire cutters, the medic who treated sick prisoners without hesitation, the clerk who recorded names and issued cards. Each small act of compliance with the standard was a thread in the fabric of order that held civilization together when everything else was falling apart. From the checkpoint, The women were transported to a transit camp near Hanover, a sprawling facility that processed thousands of prisoners each week. The camp was organized chaos, rows of tents and prefabricated huts, administrative buildings with typewriters clattering day and night, supply depots overflowing with rations and clothing and medical supplies. Margaret and the others were assigned to a section designated for female prisoners, nurses, clerks, signals operators, anyone who had served in auxiliary roles. The first night, they slept on cots under canvas, exhausted but warm, listening to the sounds of the camp settling around them. Guards walked patrols. Generators hummed. Somewhere in the distance, a gramophone played swing music, incongruous and oddly comforting. Margaret lay awake, staring at the canvas roof, and thought about the patients she had left behind in Bremen. She wondered if they had survived. She wondered if any of this mattered. The next morning, the routine began. Roll call at 0700. Breakfast at 0730, porridge, bread, tea. Work assignments at 0900. The women were divided into groups based on skills and physical condition. Those with medical training were assigned to the camp infirmary. Those with clerical experience worked in the administrative offices. Others were given laundry details, kitchen duties, maintenance tasks. The work was tedious but not oppressive, and it provided structure in a world that had lost all structure. Margaret was assigned to the infirmary, where she worked alongside British medics treating prisoners with everything from minor injuries to serious illnesses. The conditions were rudimentary, limited supplies, overcrowding, makeshift facilities, but the care was competent and humane. British doctors treated German patients with the same professionalism they would have extended to their own troops. No one was denied treatment. No one was punished for being sick. One afternoon, a young German soldier was brought in with a badly infected leg wound. He was delirious with fever, thrashing and shouting in German. Margaret helped hold him down while a British surgeon cleaned and dressed the wound, administering penicillin, a precious resource, still relatively new, to fight the infection. The soldier screamed. The surgeon worked calmly, methodically, his hands steady. When it was done, he looked at Margaret and said in slow, careful German, "He'll live. Keep him hydrated. Change the dressing twice a day." She nodded. "Thank you." The surgeon shrugged. "It's my job." It was such a simple statement, such an unremarkable sentiment. But it carried weight. This was not charity. This was not propaganda. This was professionalism, duty, the quiet insistence that standards mattered even when the world was ending. Among the women in Margaret's section, hierarchies formed and reformed in the fluid dynamics of captivity. There was Lena, 34, a signals operator who had been captured in Denmark and who carried herself with the rigid discipline of someone determined not to break. There was Frida, 22, a clerk from Hamburg who cried at night but smiled during the day, maintaining a facade of resilience that fooled no one but comforted everyone. There was Ingrid, 40, a nurse who had served on the Eastern Front and who rarely spoke, her silence a wall built from experiences too terrible to share. Each carried her own burdens, her own fears, her own strategies for survival. They formed alliances, shared rations, comforted each other in the long hours after lights out when the darkness amplified every anxiety. They were not friends, not quite. Friendship required trust, and trust was a luxury they could not afford. But they were companions in uncertainty, bound by shared experience and the instinct to endure. Lena kept a diary, writing in pencil on scraps of paper she hoarded from the administrative offices. Her entries were terse, factual, stripped of emotion. April 27th. Worked in supply depot. Sorted blankets. British corporal asked if I played chess. Said yes. He brought a board. We played 3 games. I won 2. He laughed and said I was too good for him. Strange to hear laughter again. May 2nd. Frida received a letter from Red Cross. Her mother is alive, living in Hamburg. Frida wept for an hour. I did not know what to say. I have not heard from anyone. I do not know if there is anyone left to hear from. May 8th. The war is over. Official surrender announced this morning. We stood in formation while the commandant read the terms. No one cheered. No one cried. We just stood there, silent, waiting for someone to tell us what comes next. The end of the war did not bring immediate clarity. Prisoners remained in camps, awaiting repatriation orders that came slowly, delayed by bureaucracy and the sheer scale of displacement. Millions of people were on the move, refugees, soldiers, concentration camp survivors, forced laborers. The Allies had to sort through the chaos, verifying identities, determining destinations, arranging transport. For the women in Margaret's camp, the waiting was agonizing. Some received letters from home, delivered by the Red Cross. Others heard nothing. Margaret wrote to her family in Stuttgart, a letter that took 3 weeks to arrive and another 3 weeks to receive a reply. When the response came, it was from her sister. Their parents were alive, the house had been damaged but was still standing, the city was occupied by French forces, food was scarce but manageable. The letter ended with a question: "When are you coming home?" Margaret did not know. No one knew. Repatriation was organized by region, by priority, by availability of transport. Women were processed last, after male combatants, after the critically ill, after anyone deemed more urgent. The waiting stretched into weeks, then months. During that time, the camp settled into a strange normalcy. Work continued. Meals were served. Guards and prisoners coexisted in a routine that was neither hostile nor friendly but simply functional. Small gestures of humanity accumulated: a guard who brought extra bread to a pregnant prisoner, a British officer who allowed a makeshift chapel to be set up for Sunday services, a medic who stayed late to treat a child's fever. One evening in June, a British soldier organized a concert in the camp's central yard. Prisoners and guards gathered as a gramophone played records, swing, classical, folk songs. A few prisoners sang along. A few guards clapped. It was not celebration, not reconciliation, but it was acknowledgement that life, somehow, continued. If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe, the next scene will challenge you even more. The ideological reckoning happened slowly, in fragments, in moments that forced the prisoners to confront the gap between what they had been taught and what they had experienced. Lena, the signals operator, had a conversation with the British corporal she played chess with. They were sitting in the supply depot during a break, drinking tea, when he asked her a question. "Did you believe it? The propaganda?" She did not answer immediately. She thought about the posters, the speeches, the promises of victory and destiny. She thought about the way belief had been mandatory, how doubt was treason, how questioning meant danger. Finally, she said, "I believed what I was told. I had no reason not to." He nodded. "And now?" She looked at him, this young man who had every reason to hate her, who had seen what her country had done, who had fought and bled to stop it. She said, "Now I don't know what to believe." He took a sip of tea. "Maybe that's a start." It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was simply an acknowledgement that the process of unlearning might take a lifetime. In August, repatriation orders finally came. Margaret and the others were informed they would be transported back to Germany within the week. The news brought relief and dread in equal measure. Relief because captivity, however humane, was still captivity. Dread because home was no longer the place they had left. Germany was occupied, divided, its cities in ruins, its people scattered or dead or changed beyond recognition. The journey back was organized, orderly, almost anticlimactic. They were loaded onto trucks, then trains, then trucks again, crossing borders that no longer meant what they once had. When Margaret arrived in Stuttgart, she found a city she barely recognized. Her family's street was half destroyed, buildings reduced to rubble, survivors living in cellars and makeshift shelters. Her parents had aged a decade in the years she had been gone. Her sister was thin, hollow-eyed, working in a relief kitchen run by the occupying forces. They embraced. They wept. They did not speak of the war, not then, not for years. There was too much to process, too much grief, too much shame and confusion and exhaustion. Instead, they focused on survival, finding food, rebuilding the house, navigating the new reality of occupation and reconstruction. Margaret worked as a nurse again, this time in a hospital run by the American Red Cross. The work was familiar, the routine similar, but the context had changed. She was no longer serving the Reich. She was serving the defeated, the displaced, the survivors. It was strange, this inversion. It was also necessary. Decades later, in the 1980s, a historian researching women's experiences in World War II contacted Margaret. He had found her name in archived camp records, tracked her down through municipal registries. He asked if she would be willing to share her story. She hesitated, then agreed. The interview lasted 4 hours. The historian asked about conditions in the camp, about interactions with British personnel, about the moment the ropes were cut. Margaret answered carefully, trying to convey the complexity of what she had experienced, the fear and the relief, the propaganda and the reality, the difficulty of reconciling what she had been taught with what she had witnessed. At the end, the historian asked, "What do you want people to understand?" She thought for a long time. Then she said, "That decency is a choice. The British soldiers who guarded us had every reason to be cruel. We were the enemy. We had brought war to their shores, killed their brothers, destroyed their cities. But they chose restraint. Not because we deserved it, but because they believed it was right. That choice, that refusal to become what they fought, is what civilization looks like when it's tested. I want people to know that even in the worst circumstances, decency is possible. It's difficult. It requires will. But it's possible. The historian published his findings in an academic journal. Margaret's testimony was quoted extensively. The story reached a small audience, then faded, as such stories do, into the vast archive of the past. But the truth remained. In a muddy field west of Bremen, a British sergeant had cut ropes and said, "You're not animals." In that moment, in that gesture, mercy survived. Not as policy, not as propaganda, but as the deliberate choice of ordinary people who refused to let the war erase their humanity. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to this channel and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. Margaret lived until 2001, dying at the age of 84 in the same city where she had been born. Her funeral was small: family, a few friends, colleagues from the hospital where she had worked for 30 years. No one mentioned the war. It was ancient history by then, a chapter closed, a story told and retold until it became something other than memory. Her children found her papers afterward, letters from the war, photographs, and the memoir she had written in the 1980s but never published. They read it together, learning for the first time the details of what she had endured and survived. One passage stood out, underlined in faded ink. The sergeant with the wire cutters never knew what his gesture meant. To him, it was procedure, nothing more: cut the ropes, process the prisoners, move on to the next task. But to me, standing in that muddy field with my hands bound and my future uncertain, it was everything. It was proof that mercy had not died, that decency still existed, that the world had not entirely lost its mind. I have spent my life trying to honor that moment, trying to be worthy of the kindness I was shown by people who owed me nothing. Her children donated the memoir to an archive specializing in women's wartime experiences. It sits now in a temperature-controlled vault, available to researchers, a testament to the possibility of restraint in the midst of collapse. The morning air smelled of diesel and wet earth. 53 women stood at a roadside, hands bound, bracing for violence. What came instead was a sergeant with wire cutters and 5 words that changed everything: "You're not animals. Hold still." The ropes fell away. Blood returned to numbed hands. And in that moment, in that gesture, civilization reasserted itself, not through grand declarations or sweeping policies, but through the quiet, unglamorous choice of one man who believed that even enemies deserved dignity. The war had taught them fear, restraint taught them that humanity endures.